The professionals who struggle most after they stop working are not the ones who weren't mentally strong enough for retirement. They are the ones whose brains were most developed by their careers. If that landed somewhere, if something in you recognized that before the sentence was finished, this video is going to explain why, and why it changes what you owe your brain right now. Because what most people call the adjustment period is actually something more specific, something the retirement industry doesn't have language for, because the retirement industry was not designed around people with careers like yours. Here is what this video covers. First, what a high-demand career actually does to the brain, structurally, measurably, not metaphorically. Second, what happens when that demand stops, and why the experience you've been having is the predictable result, not a personal failure. And third, what the research actually points toward, specifically for a brain built the way yours was built. By the end of this video, the restlessness you've been treating as a problem to fix is going to look like something else entirely. There is something that happens to a brain that spends 35 years making high-stakes decisions. Not the kind of thing that shows up in how someone feels about their work, the kind of thing that shows up on a scan. Research on prefrontal cortex development, the region responsible for planning, judgment, complex decision-making, and the management of competing priorities, consistently shows that cognitive demand shapes neural architecture over time. The brain responds to what is asked of it. A brain that spent 4 decades navigating institutional complexity, reading rooms accurately, making calls under uncertainty with real consequences. That brain developed specific capacities in response to specific demands. This is not a metaphor for staying sharp. It is a description of what a career like yours did to the physical structure of the brain that ran it. The executive function systems, the networks that activate when there is a problem worth solving, a decision with stakes, a team that needs direction. Those systems were exercised the way a competitive athlete exercises muscle. And here is what that means for what comes next. Because the relevant question is not whether that brain is still capable. It clearly is. The relevant question is, what does a brain built under that kind of demand actually require when the demand stops? That question does not have a simple answer, but it has a specific one. And the retirement industry almost universally gets it wrong, not through malice, through a mismatch between the framework and the population it was designed for. The framework was built for a world where retirement was shorter, where people left careers that were physically demanding rather than cognitively demanding, and where the goal was rest from labor rather than redirection of capacity. That framework does not apply to you. It was not designed for a brain like yours. Now let's look at what the research on cognitive engagement in retired professionals actually shows. When a brain that has been operating under high executive demand is removed from that environment, it does not simply downshift. It continues generating the neurochemical conditions for engagement. The systems that were built for complex high-stakes thinking do not go quiet because the paychecks stopped. They continue firing. They continue producing the internal state that, for 35 years, preceded a problem worth solving. And when there is no problem worthy of those systems, when the day offers nothing that matches the cognitive profile of what the brain was built to do, the result is not peace. The result is exactly the specific discomfort you've been living. The restlessness that arrives on a Tuesday morning with nothing wrong. The low-grade dissatisfaction that persists through activities that are supposed to feel like enough. The sense that something is still pending, unresolved, that you cannot locate or name. That is not a personality problem. That is a demand generation system operating exactly as it was built, and finding nothing in the environment that meets its output. Now here is the part that the wellness industry tends to miss. The prescriptions that get offered most often, puzzles, light volunteering, hobbies, social groups, are not wrong because they aren't valuable. They are wrong because they don't match the cognitive profile of the demand the brain was trained to generate. A crossword puzzle engages memory retrieval and pattern recognition. It does not engage the executive function systems that spent 35 years managing competing priorities under real uncertainty with real consequences. A social group provides connection. It does not provide the specific neurochemical engagement that comes from being the person in the room whose judgment carries weight. The brain does not experience these as equivalent, and the gap between what is offered and what the brain requires is where the guilt enters. Because the assumption installed quietly by the culture around this transition is that if the activities feel like enough, something is right. And if they don't, something is wrong with the person. That assumption is the source of most of the unnecessary suffering in this transition. It locates the problem in the person. The problem is not in the person. The problem is in the mismatch between what the brain was built to do and what it has been given to do. There is a conclusion that many high-achieving professionals come to, quietly, somewhere in the first year of retirement. They don't say it out loud. They don't usually say it to their partner. They barely say it to themselves. But it is there. The conclusion is this: wanting more, wanting real challenge, real demand, real consequence, is embarrassing. It signals an inability to be satisfied, an inability to relax. A personality that was always too attached to achievement to allow itself to simply exist. That conclusion is wrong. Not as encouragement, as a factual statement about what the research shows. What you have been calling restlessness, your brain calls demand. The cognitive systems built over decades of high-stakes professional life do not produce that demand because you are unwilling to let go. They produce it because that is what they were built to produce. And when you suppress the signal, when you tell yourself the ambition is vanity or selfishness or the sign of a person who never learned to be present, you are not succeeding at retirement. You are depriving a high-performance cognitive system of what it requires to maintain the function it was built for. The English Longitudinal Study of Aging, one of the most significant long-term studies on cognitive health in older adults, produced findings on what happens to cognitive performance when intellectual engagement is removed from the daily structure of a professional's life. The findings are not ambiguous. Cognitive performance in high-achieving adults declines measurably faster when meaningful intellectual engagement is absent, and the protective effect of that engagement is not replicated by passive activity or social activity alone. The brain requires the specific kind of engagement it was trained for, which means the guilt you have been carrying about wanting more is not just unnecessary. It is the response to the wrong diagnosis. You were not told you were a brain that would require continued high-level engagement for the next 20 to 30 years. You were told to relax. Those are not the same instruction. And for a brain built the way yours was built, they were never going to produce the same result. Your restlessness is not a problem. It is a signal. And the only question worth asking now is not how to quiet it. It is what it is pointing toward. If what this video has named is something you want to act on, not just understand, there is a structured protocol in the description built specifically for this. It is called the Brain on Purpose. It is a science-backed daily framework designed for professionals navigating this transition. Not generic brain health advice, but a protocol calibrated to the cognitive profile of someone who built a career on high-demand thinking. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. So what does a brain built under high executive demand actually require? The research points toward 3 categories of engagement, not activities categories. The distinction matters, because the goal is not to find something that fills time. The goal is to find something that matches the cognitive profile of what the brain was trained to do. The first category is structured intellectual challenge with real stakes. Real stakes does not mean manufactured pressure. It means the outcome of the thinking matters to something beyond the thinker. A decision that affects someone else's organization, livelihood, or direction. A problem where being wrong has a consequence. This is the category where consulting and advisory work live, not because they are the only options, but because they are the category of engagement that most directly replicates the cognitive conditions under which that brain was built. The second category is expert retrieval under social pressure. This is the specific cognitive act of accessing deep expertise in real time, in a context where others are listening, and the quality of the retrieval matters. Teaching, mentoring, speaking, advising, not explaining something simple, retrieving something hard in front of someone who needs it, in a context where the expertise is the point. The brain that built that expertise over 35 years did not build it to be stored. It built it to be deployed. And the neurochemical engagement that comes from deploying it under real conditions with a real audience is not replicated by explaining the same thing to no one. The third category is work with consequence, planning with a real outcome, building something that did not exist before, making decisions whose results will be visible. This is not about needing to feel important. This is about engaging the planning and executive function systems that require a forward horizon, a future state they are working toward, to operate the way they were designed to operate. Now, here is the answer to the objection that may have been running in the background since we began. The objection that says, "This sounds like I just can't let go." like a personality problem, an identity that never learned to exist without a role. The research does not support that framing. What it supports is this. The brain that spent 35 years operating under high executive demand has a specific cognitive profile. That profile has requirements. And those requirements do not go away because the institutional context that used to meet them has been removed. The desire for engagement is not the sign of a person who failed to learn how to retire. It is the sign of a brain reporting accurately on what it needs. That is not the same thing. And treating it like the same thing is where most of the unnecessary suffering in this transition lives. If you want to take this further, a structured, science-based daily protocol built specifically for the cognitive profile this video described. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments. That is where the framework lives. And before we close, what was the first moment you suspected the restlessness was connected to something real, and what did you tell yourself about it at the time? Leave that in the comments. Here is what this video set out to do, and what it wants to leave you with. You arrived, most likely, with a question you've been carrying for a while. Not the surface question. Not, what should I do with my time? The question underneath that one. The one that asks whether the wanting is legitimate. Whether the ambition that survived the last day of work, that kept arriving every morning regardless of what was decided the night before, is a signal worth following, or a flaw worth correcting. The research answers that question, not with encouragement, with evidence. The brain you built over a career like yours has a specific architecture. That architecture has requirements. And the requirements do not disappear because the institutional structure that used to meet them has ended. What you have been calling an inability to relax is the demand generation system of a high-performance cognitive machine looking for inputs that used to come automatically. It is not a personality defect. It is a neurological report. And here is the reframe this video wants you to carry. The restlessness you've been treating as a personal failure, the thing you've been quietly ashamed of, is not a problem to quiet. It is information. Specific, biological, well-documented information about what your brain requires to maintain the function it was built for over the next 20 or 30 years. You were given a framework that told you to relax. Your brain was given a different instruction. And the gap between those two instructions is not a character flaw. It is the experience of a high-performance system in a low-demand environment. The expertise doesn't retire. Only the title does. What comes next is not about proving something. It is about giving a brain that was built for consequence the consequence it was built for. On terms that belong to you. Not to an institution. Not to a role. Not to a paycheck. The signal has been accurate all along. The only question now is what you do with it.